Chapter 30, Section 5, Conflict and Challenge in the Late Cold War, 1968 to 85. By the 1970s, the policies between East and West were starting to improve a little bit, and you end up with what is called détente. Détente is a French word that means relaxation of tension, and the political leaders of East and West, the US, the Soviet Union, and West Germany, made some decisions and took some steps to ease some of this conflict that had marked the 1950s and 60s. And there was an attempt politically, diplomatically, militarily to back down a bit from the brink of nuclear war that had dominated the last 20 or so years. It's an alternative to the containment policy. The containment policy says we have to stop communism from ever moving forward to any new places. This is more like, let's just leave it where it is and work on improving relations between East and West. There's a German word for this that's called Ostpolitik, Ostpolitik, and it was their version of the same thing. Let's work with the East, let's work with the communists to try to reduce tensions. The main leaders of this movement would be President Nixon from the US, West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, and his 1970 trip to Poland was the first maybe big step in détente. He basically went to Poland on behalf of the German people, and he apologized for World War II. He went and stood at the Jewish memorial to the ghetto uprising in Warsaw. He went and laid flowers there. He knelt on his knees in prayer, and he almost was asking the world for forgiveness for what the Germans had done in the Second World War. And in so doing, he was reaching out to a communist nation. Poland was communist at this point, and he's trying to open the door to peaceful talk and negotiation. It started to also improve relations between East and West Germany, which were really still one nation of people separated by two different political ideologies. The policies of détente continued through various treaties that West Germany signed with the Eastern Bloc nations that settled borders so that there was no dispute as to who had what borders after the Second World War. And then this maybe culminated in what we call the strategic arms limitation talks between the US and the Soviet Union, called SALT I and SALT II, which are all about reducing nuclear weapons. So this is in the late 60s, early 70s. This is a different approach to policies. The culmination of these efforts of détente is the Helsinki Conference, 1975 in Helsinki, Finland, where 35 nations got together and signed promises for human rights, political freedoms, and that there wouldn't be any more force used to change the borders of Europe. And this was a great idea of peace. The US was there, the Soviet Union was there, and everything looked great for about 4 years. And then there was a breakdown of détente in 1979, all throughout the 70s really, because Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, was basically ignoring the part of the Helsinki agreements that were about human rights, and the Soviet Union was never really a big fan of those. So immediately there was a lot of optimism. Reminds me of the 1920s. Remember the Kellogg-Briand Pact? Very similar type of a thing. Also, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979 to try to support a communist government there that was attempting to take over Afghanistan. This led to the U.S. to support the opponents of the communists in Afghanistan, who are known as the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters they call themselves. So it's another little Vietnam-type war on a much smaller scale in Afghanistan. This led to a lot of mistrust between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We thought, well, they're not practicing détente. At this point, Jimmy Carter was our president in the late 70s. He responded to the invasion of Afghanistan by enacting economic sanctions, which are economic punishments, saying we're not going to trade with you or do business with you. He found very little support in the world for this approach, the economic sanctions approach. Only Great Britain supported our sanctions against the Soviet Union, so it was sort of a sputtering, half-hearted effort to punish the Soviets for invading Afghanistan and sort of breaking the Helsinki agreements. Another thing Jimmy Carter did was, as a retaliation for not being a part of for the Soviets invading Afghanistan, is he withdrew our Olympic team from the 1980 Summer Olympics, which were being held in Moscow that year, as a political protest for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Very controversial move. The Soviets retaliated against us in the same way 4 years later when the Olympics were held in Los Angeles in 1984. The Soviets didn't participate. So even the world of sports was dragged into this conflict which was pretty much the end of détente. This changes. This policy starts to change in the 1980s when détente pretty much comes to an end, and you have a resurgence of more aggressive action taken toward the Soviets. It's the conservative movement of the 1980s, led by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Helmut Kohl. These three leaders kind of worked together in the mid-80s to take a tougher stand, many would argue, against the Soviet Union. They called it the evil empire, where Reagan went to the Berlin Wall and gave a famous speech in which he asked that the wall be torn down. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And so they took, at least verbally in speeches, they made more of an outward stand against the Soviets. Increased military spending, build up our armed forces in the West so that the Soviets might be defeated in the East. So here's Reagan, here's Thatcher, who was called the Iron Lady, conservative prime minister, first female prime minister of England. She was in power for all of the 1980s. More than 10 years. And then in West Germany, the chancellor was Helmut Kohl, who's called the 20th century Bismarck for his work after Germany became reunited in 1989-90. We'll get to that in the last chapter. So these three leaders instituted sort of a new approach to dealing with the communists, more taking a tougher stand and building up the armed forces, even at the cost of a lot of money and going into debt. Communism was weakening by the mid-1980s, and there's debate over whether or not these conservative policies actually led to that, or whether this would have happened anyway, so it's a historical debate. Section C, the women's movement. So we pick it up again. We've already had this in one part of this chapter, and it continues. This is now the second time we're talking about this. The women's movement becomes similar to the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s in that there becomes not only an intellectual approach through books and literature, but through protest as well and political action. So that's where maybe where it takes a bit of a different tone. The very famous book by Simone de Beauvoir is called The Second Sex, and this really lays out from 1949 the idea of sexism in the modern age, that women have been treated like second-class citizens for most of human history, and that it's through that it needs to change. This Simone de Beauvoir was a rich girl. She was born in a bourgeoisie middle-class family, and she criticized her own mother's lifestyle, which was that she was simply a wife and a mother and very submissive to her husband and all these kind of things. So only through courageous action and self-assertive creativity could a woman completely escape from the inferior role that men had constructed for them. This is her thesis of the book. Betty Friedan is an American author that comes along about 15 years later and basically also defines sexism and says that women have been forced to live like children for most of history and live only for their husbands and children. And this has created lots of anxious women and women who are no longer experiencing personal fulfillment in their life. So two leading intellectuals give voice to the feminist movement after World War II. This all culminates in the founding of the National Organization for Women, known as NOW. This happened in 1970 or so, 1966, excuse me. By 1974, there were 40,000 members of the National Organization for Women in the U.S., and some of this organization's campaign platforms, as they still are today, it's still in existence, anti-discrimination in the workplace, this is big, equal pay for equal work, the right to, and then in terms of social and family rights, the right to divorce around the world, child care rights, which means you can have the right to have daycare, let's say, maybe provided by the government or help at least paid for part of it. And then most controversially, the women's movement started to demand the right to abortion across the world. And this is in 1972. Roe versus Wade in the U.S. was a result of this movement. And this is still the most controversial aspect of the women's movement, I would say. There are anti-feminist movements that grew in response to this, led by, in some cases, other women. So this is still one of the most heated political issues in the world today. For Catholic countries, the women's movement was a huge change forward. For example, Italy, where traditional views of women really were a part of centuries of their history. So especially things like abortion in a Catholic country becomes really kind of controversial. We'll stop here for today, and I will pick up with another podcast actually that's a little bit shorter for the part 5.